Hello everyone, today we talk about the Western European Knight around 1100. For our historical military units series, I have created also properly a Western European Knight playlist, as we will list tens if not hundreds of examples from various times and places. And today we take as a sample the images depicted on the Legend of King Arthur carved relief at the Pescheria door of the Modena Cathedral in Lombardy, actually Emilia, but at the time Lombardy was kind of more broadly and culturally intended, and this great part of the western and central Po Valley. And definitely the prototype that we draw from this beautiful work of art, by the way, among the many others that are present in situ. This is just the north door, but there are others also. The interiors are fantastic for same military historical reasons. We will partially talk about other figures aside from the knight that are present here in this very carved relief, but also in another where we have a longbowman, for example, etc. But we picked this for the knightly sample as it's pretty beautifully standard for a Western European knight of the time, quite fitting for the broader, especially post-Carolingian world, as fundamentally these figures show how northern Italian military equipment was basically the same as that of Germany or France, right? And also, temporally speaking, given that this relief dates back to actually the 30s of the 12th century, 1135 perhaps, rather than some have an early date, and even say that it's late 11th, right, early 12th. But let's say it can perfectly serve for a first half of the 12th century standard prototype, right? And so this video is also the chance to talk a bit about the also other evidence in the meanwhile, but also at broader aspects drawn from other archaeological evidence. So the diversity of knightly armor during this era naturally has to be assessed from a multiplicity of sources and evidence that today we cannot digress on, right? The other day made a video about the 11th century Spanish heavy infantrymen, just to make an example, and you can see there how much digging in the individual manuscript, especially, you can draw from what that context really was. But when we look, in fact, at Western European warfare during this time and the following centuries, there is actually a massive homogenization of panoply, right? That is naturally connected to the broader, development of Frankish military culture that was being pioneered technologically also mostly by France and Italy, as a matter of fact, but in pretty comparable ways that were present pretty much everywhere at this point in this war. The same development of, the same arms and armor you can see basically occurs in various modifications in parallel chronologically, which is astonishing, because you realize basically everywhere in this pretty large area, knights from everywhere were in fact updating their armor more or less at the same time, all the rest of this region. So definitely medieval warfare was brutally accelerating also in the collective participation. Say, think about the Crusades, but collective training properly as the broader capacity of feudal monarchies, or in this case, city-states, to also participate in great coalition armies and essentially sharing an enormity of military knowledge that eventually reflected on all the participants. And these pictures that I uploaded today all show essentially cavalry. So as we've explained also in the aforementioned Spanish heavy infantryman video, these were very often fighting also as dismounted knights, right? So they would have looked better, let's say, for illustrating the armor details as models, right? As man can in different pose, possibly standing on foot, but we can assume interesting characteristics also in general, part of what we can see just from this relief, but also considering other sources. The important aspect about the panoply differences is that they are homogeneous but still characteristic in a way or another. We will talk today, for example, about the difference in armor, right? Can you say that there's a typical knight at this time? Well, yes, but at the same time, you cannot say, if you look at the details, there is, by some standard, a typical armor, right? When we look at these knights on the Modena Cathedral, we look at what would be like a standard, like, as we were saying before, like in this case, it's an Italian knight, it could be Italo-Norman, it could be Western Frankish, Eastern Frankish, mostly from, again, the first half of the 12th century. And the basic equipment was at this time undergoing very little real change, right? So that this is what makes, in essence, this panoply relatively standard. For around actually a century, also a bit before this time, and also even a bit later, the main changes that took place centered principally around the design of helmet and shield, right? But especially the armor was pretty much the same. The essentials are clear anyhow. It's mostly a conical helmet, a kite-shaped shield, an hauberk that can, as we'll see now, cover more or less parts of the legs and of the arms, and a lance, a sword, right, and maybe a side weapon of some kind. And let's look at some shade here. On the Modena Cathedral, all but one of the knights wear long-sleeved mail hauberks, as yet without mittens, but including gloves, interestingly enough. So the mail hauberk, that in contemporary sources may be recorded in different ways, including Asperkot, Ausberg, and Aubert, remained the principal form of body armor in Western Europe throughout all this period, renowningly enough. The mail could be single or double. Essentially, the rings could be either riveted or butted, right? And each individual ring was interlocked with the adjacent four. In double mail, that you sometimes encounter, the rings were much thicker, so that they overlapped considerably more. Some rings were punched from thin plate and used in alternate rows with the more usual riveted or butted ring type. Sometimes the hauberk was recorded to be so closely interwoven that not even a dagger point could penetrate its links. Today we will not talk about armor penetration, but I talked about it here and there already, and while the hauberk provided with essentially the best protection in terms of costs benefits, still considered that armor and arms always went in parallel in terms of coping with each other, and arms such as also dagger points were often used at a close range as a side weapon, also by other troops, not just knights. There were even unarmored troops, as we will see also in the Modena reliefs, that would aggress knights, right? That could, for example, immobilize them once they had unhorsed them, etc. Would try to, stick with, especially and naturally in the gaps of the armor that were open just structurally and or by damage, which could still happen. If you look at that pickaxe that will appear, or maybe already has, in the pictures, you will realize that, of course, the links could break, right? And it is possible to penetrate such armor in many ways, right? Just it's not typical, but of all the blows that you will get, you can be sure that some of them will have that function, so much that notoriously also plate armor will develop in the following centuries for similar reasons. We will also talk about actually other type of armor, because there is not just the mail hauberk, there is also something else. The mail was also gilded or silvered, right? More often blackened, hence also the legions of black knights, etc., which was a practice aimed at avoiding oxidation, which continued up until the 17th century, right? And in fact, painting or enameling of armor appears to have been far more common than we consider. In fact, even when you look at, I don't know, the beginning of this era, the Saint Bayeux tapestry depicts actually many helmets with colored panels, which may indicate that they were painted. We were just talking about it the other day in that video about medieval English and Welsh warfare, mostly around this era. That's another issue, because there is the matter of how were these helmets built through segments. Some were similar to in construction to the older Spangen helm, also because of the Eastern European influences in Anglo-Danish warfare via, the Vikings, etc. But in general, the idea of coloring armor and basically any other element of the panoply, and that would make medieval armies some of the most colorful spectacles that you can ever imagine in history, rather than kind of the gray, kind of raw metal looking kind of tone, is in fact a very overlooked aspect, because mail was painted as well, right? And we are pretty much sure of that. Certainly, for example, a large number of manuscript sources of the 12th, 13th centuries show colored helmets as well, and depict mail in unusual colors, such as red and green, right, and more. Also yellow, blue, and blackened armor, as we've seen, was undoubtedly an attempt at protection against rust. Could also symbolize in the broader, in some contexts at least, that were coupled with other proto-heraldic symbolism that included, importantly, color, etc., a specific quality of the knight. It was quite personalized in that fashion. Another relatively underappreciated in terms of effective protection type of armor was the kilted tunic, later called aketon and gambeson, usually worn under and very occasionally over to the hauberk. This is true also for mails or scale armor as well. If you look at some video we made about the Tagmata horsemen, for example, Byzantine cavalry, some point between the 10th, 11th century, were at the top of military technology design, you realize that different layers of armor could be actually worn also over the same other layers of metal armor, and the same goes for padded armor as well. So aketons and or gambesons, because the term, there are also other terminologies here, but were made up essentially of kilted leather, linen, or woolen tunics stuffed with wool, cotton, tow, and old rags, so anything would do. And in contemporary sources, they are usually depicted colored as well, so making pendant with the rest of the armor, literally. Even here we find pastel shades of red, blue, green, yellow, and buff, right? With red being apparently the most popular color, maybe because of the old reason that it could conceal blood stains better. The Byzantine chronicler Niketas Koniates, that provides with interesting military information occasionally, even though he wasn't particularly just about that, but describes the kilted armor of Conrad of Montferrat, that was a commander of the Byzantine army Latinicon regiment in 1187, to have been made of as many as 18 layers of red linen, right, treated with a mixture of salt and rough wine so that it was allegedly impervious to sword or lance blows. And this is a very interesting information, materially speaking, but also because Conrad of Montferrat was here a Western European knight, exactly from northern Italy, like the source we look at today. It was at the head of essentially the Latin troops in Byzantine service. So these were essentially other Westerners coming a bit from everywhere. At the time, yes, we are mostly in a time of important Italo-Norman influence there, but there were Italians, French, etc. So it's the perfect example also that could fit for a Western knight prototype of this time. And as you see, the same Akaton here is considered to be used properly against sword or lance blows. Geoffroy de Visneuf, a chronicler of the Third Crusade, so also here talking about the end of the 12th century, refers likewise to kilted armor as, quote, difficult to pierce. He describes pourpoint, that is an alternative name for such armor, that was also embroidered with, beautiful decoration, as armor of, quote, of many folds of linen, right? So, again, this was also probably quite expensive considering the composition and also this broader decoration, and it fit, this is what we have to consider, it fit the broader panoply altogether, right? And also this decoration fit what we often overlook too about armor, that is the psychological effect that it had to provide, right? Not just on the enemy, but on the same wearer, right? We know psychologically there are certain colors, etc., that spark certain emotions, right? And or that these knights, as we've seen for proto-heraldic reasons, were particularly attached to as their ancestral symbology, but also an enemy that looks at you and sees you in this very colorful, shiny, very often you have replicas of these helmets for how they should have been. We think they were built at the time. They look just like modern motorcycle helmets in terms properly of visual effect, of type of paint, of light reflection, etc. So they look beautiful, right? You are always remember in the mentality of the medieval knight is not modern, it's not secular. You are the expression of a divine power that takes on certain characteristics, again, on the base of the, in which, your existence has been declined, but that is part of a broader symbol that you're living within to deliver this pure force and action and victory through the same divinity. So even just like a knight that of course was elite in many ways, usually there were at this point many knights that were not particularly affluent, and still the system was relatively open, the estate. But the idea of having an enemy that can afford to even just ruin this armor, just think about the terrible forces under which it it went, right, just during a cavalry charge or blows, etc. Also, this linen was surely, and that's our problem today archaeologically, also to realize in some way how it really was. It was subject to quick degradation in a way. It's organic material. That's why it was not preserved largely up to our times for us to know about this act. But deep padded armor was very effective as well. Materially speaking, its thickness obviously varied as well, but kilted corselets of later date are recorded being up to 5 centimeters or more thick, right? And naturally depended how internally consistent they really were, right? So most of the blows would be absorbed by this armor, right? Of course, a very straight 90-degree armor to blade Victorial hit would have, given that it was delivered at close range, was devastating. Could break armor as well, and the actin itself was surely not a better protection, but other blows that arrived deflected or at a distance with spent energy and so on could easily be deflected, and some that also would not, given also the non-smooth surface of the actin could in a sense partly render more difficult the hit per se. So because the body underneath is normally harder, right, and mail has let's say sometimes was worn also without Gambeson, and in that way it was risky for the body underneath. If you had the Gambeson underneath, instead you have this essentially barrier that keeps you more protected, and that absorbs the blow for your body. It still receives atrocious hits. You can easily break somebody's body and bleed for an eternal hemorrhage. Somebody that is fully equipped like this, it happened. But the idea is that it had to be difficult, right, rare, and this armor generally made its work pretty well. Right? You would receive really a lot of hits as a knight, right? Especially like in any situation you can imagine, but just think during the siege warfare, all the possible stuff thrown at you, also in cavalry or even infantry combat, like just being hit continuously. It's terrifying, right? You would be pierced, you would be hit. Even arrows penetrated armor and would make you bleed, and maybe you would get literally tens of that, right, without getting a mortal wound, but still losing an important amount of blood altogether, and exhausting yourself, and also creating problem for dressing the armor again, right? Because we were talking about that in exactly the video about the reasons of Mongol victories according to Western sources. They were complaining about this fact that Western armor was good at stopping arrows normally, but the Mongols had apparently some form of armor that was given that archery was more prominent in the steppe. Let's say more fit for avoiding that kind of also underneath scratches that would eventually irritate you once you would like, because you wouldn't be able to wear armor comfortably for days after those wounds as well. So this were all things that did matter in the broader strategic balance, right, of an army on the fight and so on. So these are always interesting aspects that the same sources of the time were taken in consideration, interestingly enough. And naturally, kilted body armor existed for hundreds of years, right? There are some debates relatively to the ancient use, etc. But of course, it was there. Just it's for some reasons, at least in certain cases, less depicted apparently. But it's also pretty relative in my opinion. In any case, about medieval warfare, it's usually said that especially Western Europe seems to have spread more the use of the Gambeson as a direct result of the Crusades, because it was a popular form of armor among the Saracens that had given the same name to it, like al-kutun, which in Arab means literally the like cotton, right? Because that's also how it was corrupted in European as akaton, etc. It all declined in all the various European languages like that. And I bet to differ anyway, because there is this mechanistic, technologistic bias for medieval warfare. That is to say, everything that was developing in the West during the 11th and 13th century was due to contact with the more advanced East. First of all, who said the East was more advanced than the West? Objectively, right? By the 12th century, the West is as advanced, if not more, actually, than both the Byzantine and the Islamic worlds. And I discussed this at length elsewhere, including that video about the bias against, in fact, the Western mounts during the same time. This was a moment of major and unparalleled expansion in relative terms of Western Europe over the rest of the continent and the Mediterranean. And Europeans were essentially developing some practical and theoretical capacities that were essentially just already at the level, the progressed level of those other civilizations. Now, for an important amount of time, there is no reason to think that the kilted armor spread more because, I don't know, the Saracens were using it. There can be an idea that, of course, that there were technical reasons why the Saracens preferred or at least were particularly, they also had heavy armor, etc. But their politics and society would bring, let's say, for example, more lightly armored troops, and so the Akaton, etc., was quite important for them, maybe more important in other ways. Also, there was more archery in the East, importantly enough. So it is possible that Crusader knights would adapt to that. We know that. There were the Turcopoles, for example, that were not just literal Turks fighting for the Christians. Even when Muslims, etc., there were Christian mercenaries in Islamic armies. We made videos about that. It was absolutely normal. There's also a climatic reason. The Near Eastern summer is not really something you would like to experience, especially covered in armor under an enemy hail of arrows, right? So but do you want to save your life, right? And there are more chances of you dying, maybe if you are not armored enough, than literally having a hit collapse, and people would die of that normally. Also in other areas, we know in the same Europe and not just in the south, people would just explode because of the heat, right? They would have to throw away their armor because it was too much, right? It was difficult to breathe in it sometimes. The same helmets, as you know, were often taken off during, in the same coifs. See also on the Bayeux, the Aventails on the Bayeux tapestry. Here are beautiful Aventails, as you see here, or at least better some coif that go across the lower part of the face as well. It was really hard, right? Of course, this armor was all fully ergonomic, anatomically, etc., and the knights would perform any kind of stunt with them, but this doesn't mean that they didn't require an astonishing amount of athleticism that has nothing to do, even remotely, with what you see, for example, in modern reenactment. It was just at another level that you have not even the idea of what it means, and not being a beefy guy who goes to the gym every day. It has zero to do with being a killer, right? A serial killer, and it's none of that, right? It's just something else. And if you don't replicate an actual medieval battlefield, which reenactment or humor, etc., are not even trying to do, even because they don't know what it is, first of all, very sadly, from a historical point of view, but on average. But the main point is that you will never know, and just because you will never be in the head of a 12th century knight, which is something that simply in terms of moral forces you cannot discern positively, right? You can't just approach by looking at other aspects, right? But the point being that if this armor was so, talking about kilted armor, was so effective, or at least it could be towards many blows, etc., the idea is that Western battlefields were becoming ever more dominated also by crossbows, even longbows. On the Modena Cathedral, you have a longbowman, right? Just for saying that, that kind of powerful shots, etc., would affect armor itself, and it was important to add this, to develop the same Gambesons, etc. Was something needed from the within of Western warfare, right? As any other warfare, given that they were pretty much all similar, so there wasn't really a reason why this wouldn't happen, right? As we will see now, there are different different aspects of personalization, customization. For example, on the Modena reliefs, you don't actually see leg armor displayed, right? That's also an important aspect of the story. Is it because maybe in infantry was not so challenging? Well, by the 12th century, Italian infantries were already something pretty challenging. Other knights elsewhere displayed that, but the fact that, again, the Modena reliefs do not show leg armor doesn't actually mean that it was not used, or that was some systemic or structural difference from other areas that, or points in common with those that had or didn't have it displayed, because we know, again, that this could be a matter of personal choice, maybe just like an artistic license by the sculptor, etc. But the point is that the alternatives are meant to provide with flexibility, right? You may want to be lighter and thus less protected, right? To be faster and thus protecting yourself through speed rather than through more intense close combat design armor. Or maybe this knight was maybe too poor to afford leg armor, right? And etc. etc. Consider that they costed a lot, right? So this could really depend on whom you were, where you came from. There's still relatively archaic times. Medieval armor, as you know, eventually develops importantly also leg protection as a standard later on, and also because of the further rise of infantries during the period, but also generally speaking the greater performance of say missile weapons and so on. But just for saying it, there are many reasons also this time for which gradually you see changes that again go always in parallel all over Western Europe, and that more or less were at the end of the day heading towards the same direction. Now, speaking of actually the terminology of kilted armor, significant contemporary sources that are pre-Linnean but do make distinctions tend to differentiate, in fact, between the Gambeson and the Aquitaine proper, right? The former being the older variety of such armor. Since, for example, actually, its name only seems to first appear in a Roman de Perceval of the 6th of the 12th century, and in Vase's Roman de Roux of more or less the same time, from around 1160, 1174. But the reasons seem to be etymological, because Gambeson is derived from the Old Frankish vamba, that means belly, right? In some older texts, the word vambais is actually substituted. So this could hint at, let's say, a type of kilted armor that was, for some reason, in design composition, traditionally present in Western warfare since an important time. But so the Aquitaine would be some kind of more evolved or more complete form. We don't know. Nevertheless, what differences there must have been, they were minimal, right? Except the accent was usually sleeveless even, right? Whereas Gambeson sleeves are mentioned frequently. So it wouldn't even necessarily speak of a Akaton superiority in to core, right? And or something you could simply differentiate even so easily, because again, all these sources are not categorical, right? Before the 18th century, there's no such thing. In order to understand pre-Linnean vocabulary, you have basically to take all the sources that use it and compare them and saying more or less what the hell did they mean and how did they see that? What is that, especially in the word, in the term itself? What is that semantically? What was semantically loaded like? That's how they mostly reason, and they reason also very concretely, by the way. So in ways that if you get the sensitivity to interpret correctly, also provide you with a much properly sounder effectiveness, right? In understanding the meaning of something that would never be as specific as a categorical definition linguistically, but just semantically, it's even more precise. This distinction could be also maybe the one between Gambeson and Akaton. And there were naturally other types of armor composition. We find, for example, from 13th century sources, right? From England, France, Spain, so still Western Europe. Something like, for example, scale corselets, right? That are undoubtedly based on a leather base, right? Structure. In some cases, it could be sleeveless. In other cases, with sleeves, and also with an upstanding collar, similar to the one that we were talking about for an Akaton before. And it's normally worn over a mail hauberk, right? As if the scale corselet itself was not regarded as a sufficient protection. So, and could simply add to that layer, right, of armor. And scale armor does seem to have remained an occasional substitute for mail in the West throughout all this period, right? It's encountered only rarely after the 13th century, except in Eastern Europe, right? But speaking of this earlier Western examples, the scales were, say, of different material. Originally, they could be even of horn, right, which was still very much in use in the West, certainly in the 12th century, possibly even the 13th. For example, Emperor Henry V, ruling between 1111 and 1125, had a body of knights equipped in horn scale armor in 1150. So more or less the same years that we're looking at, right? So troops that could have been sent to the same Italy, where also there are examples of scale armor, also because of Eastern kind of Byzantine or Islamic influence, etc. But again, it was pretty much all over Europe. During the 13th century, scales became most commonly of iron, right? But there is, again, literary and illustrative evidence that the horn was used also in later times, and so this is quite meaningful, because naturally there were different ways of armoring someone, and scale armor was pretty common even later on. There's also naturally lamellar armor by a certain degree. It depends also properly on the composition, because some scale armor also was different in the size of the scales, etc. And there are very interesting solutions. Especially Germany and Italy have this, maybe because they were, again, closer maybe to the Eastern world, but not necessarily, right? It's a mistake to presume that everything scaled is just because it's better, like anti-arrow, this kind of Oriental type of warfare. There is more to it, And still, when you think about armor in general, you have to think that, let's say, most of its usefulness was connected to the fact that it existed in the first place, right? The type of it, where we talk about scale, lamella, mail, etc., by a certain degree, especially when we're not really sure about what the actual composition and structure was like, and also considering the degree of damage that it could suffer, also in combat, the most important thing was having that armor, that layer of it, rather than what type it was, right? It was probably not a radical difference between scale and mail armor in terms of effectiveness when considering the variations in construction and so on. So in any case, we will talk about this in other videos, because this one is just more anecdotal, and it's referred to just giving an idea of what this early 12th century Western European knight could look like in general. But again, there are interesting, they are always very debated topics because, again, of the uncertainty, and in part also of the pointless aspect in itself, like that some do not really consider, because they are radically obsessed with anything like materialistic, and so they still think that warfare has to do with technology in a meaningful way. This is not the case, right? This has to do with, again, what the world was like at the time, and the difference was made by something else. Just even, again, whether you did have armor or not, but as always, and more important than anything else, beyond anything, how much you wanted to kill the person in front of you, which is the single most important thing that, again, nobody really seemed to get still about war, and that is everything, also politically speaking, and makes the thing done. In any case, for today, speaking of the Modena reliefs, head protection, it's pretty standard, aside from the coif that we mentioned. You can see in all of them, also partially covering the face, some cases. The helmets are conical with substantial nozzles, a pattern that survived throughout all this period and lasted in use, in fact, until the 14th century. By that point, as a very archaic device, as they had become decidedly old-fashioned, let's say, since the mid-13th century, when, as you know, it's the all-enveloping great helm that eventually becomes the standard knightly helmet. And also there are kind of other lighter types that, however, follow mostly other patterns, such as the chapelle de fer, etc. The helmet was normally worn over a padded arming cap, just as we've seen metal body armor was worn over a padded one. Speaking of weaponry, all the horsemen on the Modena relief, including one unarmored individual, carry heavy lances, some with large decorated and fringed gonfalons, right? And the men, seen from the left, have remarkably short swords as well, the scabbards of which are apparently outside their hauberks. And in fact, the principal weapons throughout the period were the lance, sword, and mace, or knight, and at the end of the 11th century, the lance was usually about 2.1, 0.4, sometimes up to 0.7 meters long. It was not as long as it would have become later on, as there would have been literally a competition between the horsemen and the infantryman's lance. The knightly lance was most often of ash or pine, according to Wace at least, though aspen and sycamore are also recorded in later sources anyhow. And by the 12th century at the latest, the lance too was often, if not usually, painted. So again, creating that homogeneous visual effect that the knight had morally to have on the enemy. And the function naturally is evident. Like lances can be used really in many ways, and they would always be used in every single age in any possible way ever, right? Thrown, overarm, underarm, couché, etc. And there is no kind of a standard use, right? These knights would use any weapon in any possible way, given they were trained with everything, and they would find in any situation the best way to employ the weaponry. But of course, at this point, as you know, Western cavalry was beginning to properly topping that collective training that was necessary to have such thickly packed cavalry units capable of charging with couché lengths straight into enemy formations. It's not much about the speed either. Normally, charges were carried out at canter, not at gallop. That was also risky for the same solidity of the formation. But at this point, the punching capacity, even of literally some charges were carried out at pace, because just the impact of that mass of knight and warhorse is so great. It would smash through everything, even at such low speed. Talking about ultra heavy cavalry, but at this point, that's the primary function. And then the side weapons, right, that are always useful in many ways. It could also be, missile weapons. Why not? Crossbows were used by knights on a regular basis. They could also be like side weapons, also axes, even bows for that matter, and etc. The shields on the Modena reliefs are the typically long and kite-shaped ones, mostly held on a guige, so offering this important protection mostly to the torso, laterally, in part also frontally, because they were used depending on the situation during the charge, especially mostly brought towards the front and in other situations on the side, but also with the fact the lower tip extending towards the length. It was the way at this point that, in absence still of leg armor, and especially also this example is significant, was the best protection from the lower part of the body, and also one that was importantly exposed, in fact, to enemy hits, especially the one of the infantry, etc. So it's very fascinating to look at these pictures. They're beautiful, by the way. You see that the lances are massive, by the way. That tells you properly the degree, also the physicality of these individuals, the impact, the kind of brutality that this charge, this warfare entailed properly. And what is fascinating is also these small and rather demoniacal Teutonic infantrymen wielding what could be a pickaxe or an early form of warhammer, by the way. In fact, the setting of this Arthurian cycle is not a siege per se, but at the center of the arc there is a construction of a fortification, out of which also on the right a knight emerges attacking another, which is again the heavily fortified Western European reality, very thickly net, that really put the same cavalry often at difficulty. As we've seen, knights were also the normal stormtroopers. When they were dismounted, they assaulted fortresses and so on. But here you find this infantryman who wields a weapon that is evidently and eminently anti-armor, and as such anti-knightly, or at least, even though there were, especially in this rich Italian communes, and I made a video about this specifically, very materially wealthy infantries, the majority of the armored units did belong to the knightly elite, and or to their clans in general, right? And thus, when we find them again, it's like on the Bayeux tapestry with the armored footman? Is it like an average, like a specialized infantryman, or is it, he's a knight specifically, even using those longbows and so on? Well, in this case, however, this is kind of properly what would be a commoner, right? And Wu has an anti-cavalry weapon, or at least one that can create significant damage against armor in some given context. Naturally, as he's depicted here, he would have probably not come out to attack an enemy knight in the open, given that the enemy lances would have probably transpassed him before his pickaxe could do anything. But still, it's very plausible to find in these especially fortified contexts and close range and close spaces, etc., infantrymen, commoners equipped like this. Actually, we will have to make a video about the early, probably the 11th to 12th century Italian anti-cavalry weapons that are somehow very impressive, and that prelude to that. In fact, what was happening already at the time, that important infantry development, it was the most important in Western Europe during the 12th and the 13th century, and even before, likely, and also during the early 14th, they didn't kid either. But in this context, specifically in the first half of the 12th century, was still, in fact, very much dominated also by the culture of the dismounted knight, per se, right? That would, in that case, was still an infantryman and had to cope with cavalry as well in some given contexts. Also, a word for the unarmored horsemen we see here. Naturally, this is just an artistic representation. I don't know whether we know the specifics of this character. That here again, it's the Arthurian. It's part of the Arthurian cycle, etc. But if we want to take him also as a prototype of some kind of light cavalry, well, yeah, these types of cavalry did exist, right? They could be the same squires or something that were transitioning gradually to some kind of more permanent type of tactically specialized unit, and or, however, the simple retinues, right, of these knights that could actually inflict important damage. Like throughout all the history of cavalry, even when armor was a thing importantly around, still, lancers like this one could inflict massive damage against the same armored horsemen, against the same infantry in many ways, and being, especially in a collectively trained context, being very effective, right? Because at the end of the day, yes, charging maybe would be less, let's say, advantageous than the average because of the lack of armor, as after the charge, melee follows. So even if you quickly retreat, there is always somebody that is going to remain butchered behind in the process. But it could also be important, like, cavalry units could be ambushed, could be attacked from the side, etc. And we can see in this guy also an equally, mounted infantryman, or at least, here a horseman that could dismount. And so fighting, like providing an example for also an infantry type of troopers. So as always, we will talk about Italian warfare and what was happening in this region at the time. But again, just like arms and armor, well, cavalry and infantry are always in relation with one another, right? There is not, like, even though in this time cavalry was finally becoming fully decisive, especially on the Western battlefields, right? So that essentially they were the decisive force without which infantry could not operate on its own, right? Whereas in the previous centuries, yes, cavalry was already more important in absolute terms, but infantry could win, battles. Well, at this point, you have still, in this context, like, you have already actually the cavalry being dominating or coming to fully be, right? So, in any case, consider that cavalry and infantry always fought side to side and one against the other at the same time. And the Italian situation also provides with a very interesting social strife that was, especially in the initial phase of the popular activity that occurred later, but still was not dramatically different from this time social segmentation. It's kind of also tactical opposition, and also different properly coordination on the battlefield between cavalry and infantry, right? Some victories, for example, the Lombard League against the Germanic emperors were, as you know, secured thanks to infantry. That was not decisive per se, because eventually cavalry kind of collected the tactical fruit of the infantry resistance and won the day for it. But let's say that still shows also a different, very often an autonomy, if not properly an independence between the two sides. Like infantry marching separated from cavalry at some point, and not being particularly eager to follow the knights in combat, and maybe, you know, going to plunder the enemy camp, being able to do atrocious things like reforming after having been broken by the enemy cavalry as well. So a level of training there and kind of independent mindset that, in fact, no other European infantry at that time displayed. But again, we have to open still that chapter at some point, because it's big, right? And it's basically a major turning point of the medieval art of war. In any case, this is just, you know, what you would have seen. You can interpret, and you can imagine, like, of course, in this early 12th century Lombard context. For today, I stop it here. I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.